I'm really grateful to the organizers for inviting me here, and very honored and very nervous to talk in front of this hyper-enthusiastic audience and dear colleagues and friends. Where do I turn this on? May I have some help? So anyway, when Lily invited me to talk about Utopia, Professor Blagojević, I did not really want to talk about communist utopia, although I'm a scholar of Russian architecture. Well, and I'm not a scholar of Frank Lloyd Wright, and this presentation is going to be about Frank Lloyd Wright. This is because I'm annoyed with one thing, that usually communism is associated with this great utopia, and people overlook that there are other kinds of utopias, for example, the capitalist utopia of absolute pragmatism, etc. So the title of my talk is Frank Lloyd Wright, Ayn Rand, and Hyper-Capitalist Utopia. Let me start. One of the few images in Frank Lloyd Wright's book, The Disappearing City of 1933, is a photograph of the city of New York obscured by fog. Tops of skyscrapers peek through a cloud, streets invisible. The scene can be a picture of just another foggy day, or it can be a picture of the city after Armageddon, after some gigantic explosion, filling the streets with all-devouring dust. The picture in the book does not figure as a documentary recording, but the vision of a desired cataclysm, a cataclysm which will disappear the city and erase it for good, a monstrous vortex of hellish existence. This is contrasted in the book to idyllic life without, in the Arcadian plains of the agrarian countryside, where even the clouds come to life, the magnificent cumulus replacing the dreary linear stratus above the city. The urban demon was to be replaced by a design of Wright's own making. This design is, as we very well know, the Broadway City, a potentially infinite suburban landscape in which the citizen of what Wright called Usonia would return to nature and inhabit, instead of a cramped Manhattan apartment, his own 1-acre plot of land, surrounded by wide roads. Wright worked on the project for Broadway City for more than 30 years. He rendered scenes of life in this new world, spread potentially over the entire American continent, with vehicles resembling flying saucers and other trappings of the future. I will discuss Wright's vision for Usonia as presented in The Disappearing City, a book in which there are no architectural renderings, as a matter of fact, but only a few photographs illustrating the idea. Here you can see on the side another image of an urban cataclysm. Wright claims that in this book he has produced the sketch of an ideal, whose outline is, quote, better than any specific plan for any house. The ideal is that of private property as a fundamental human right, which the citizens of Broadacre, with their 1-acre plots, will finally realize. The condition for accomplishing this ideal is herbicide, reducing the metropolis to dust. Disappearing City is more a piece of utopian fiction than a ready-made design. And it is a peculiar piece of utopian fiction since, unlike most historical utopias, starting with Thomas More's City of Amarat, continuing, for example, with Bacon's New Organon and William Morris's News from Nowhere, it is decidedly anti-urban. Another specific characteristic of the Broadacre utopia is that it is a right-wing rather than a left-wing one. Peter Fitting discussed this rare phenomenon in his article, Utopias Beyond Our Ideals. This is in the journal Utopian Studies, which is completely left-wing, where he made the distinction between left and right-wing utopias according to two basic criteria. The main characteristic of left-wing utopias is the abolishment of property rights and the idea that a strong and enlightened government should guarantee the equality of the citizens. Right's utopia, in contrast, centers on the ideal of private property, the ownership of one-acre plots. In addition, Wright cites the Jeffersonian motto in his book: that government which is the best government is that which is the least government, as his guiding principle, leaving only the architect, the author of the master plan, to mediate social issues through design. In his fictional utopia, Wright criticizes capitalism, but does not aim to provide anti-capitalism, but a better version of it. Rather than a left-wing utopia, Wright's scheme is a nostalgic agrarian hyper-capitalism. How does the anti-urban attitude, bordering on the dream of urbicide, fit together with hyper-capitalist utopia? What is the kind of modernism defined by the confluence of two ideas? In order to answer this question, I will read The Disappearing City together with another fictional work, Ayn Rand's novel The Fountainhead of 1943. The Fountainhead sold millions of copies, was turned into a popular film with Gary Cooper in 1949, and is the most popular representation of Wright's work and persona. Although the objectivist philosophy of Ayn Rand, according to which ethics is based on selfishness, differs from Wright's ideal of selfhood without selfishness, which he promotes as a central value of his utopian society, the two are closely linked together. The Fountainhead is an extension of Wright's principles and is the most popular representation of Wright, here played by Gary Cooper. It is a novel that is based on interviews with Wright himself and canonized him arguably more than his own writing. Set in the city, it provides a dystopian vision of urban life, which complements Wright's agrarian utopia. Main ideas about the architect genius and the grim picture of the city are common to both. The Fountainhead, as you might recollect, is about Howard Rourke, the genius, self-taught architect, not understood by his Philistine, duplicitous, and career-mongering colleagues and critics, the urban establishment against which Rourke wages a battle. Rourke suffers, but bears the suffering completely confident in his talent and driven by his passion, not compromising with the society around him, is determined to build his modernist vision. He asserts his creative rights at the end of the book, but blowing up a mass housing project he designed because it was altered by other architects. In court, he defends himself, explaining the role of great men in the development of civilization, and is acquitted because of his great ideas. This particular hyper-capitalist and heroic sort of modernism, depicted in Wright's utopia and Rand's dystopia, which corresponds to it, has several characteristics which I will analyze. It is the ideology of the denial of ideology, dismissal of collective identities, hypermasculinity, and anti-intellectualism. What is ideology and what is the denial of ideology? In this case, the most relevant discussion of utopia and the relationship, its relationship to ideology, is that developed by Frederick Jameson in The Political Unconscious. Jameson writes that utopia is essentially means of, so to say, luring the reader to accept a certain system of values and beliefs. Something that provides an attractive and comprehensive picture of a society based on those beliefs, and as wish fulfillment creates an emotional attachment to ideology. For Jameson, utopia is the expression of class consciousness, in that it projects the ideal life of a collective. Rendering life beyond the real, life in utopos, it renders what Wright calls the tangible sketch of the ideal. Jameson writes that utopia projects the ideal life of a collectivity. Now, this is easy to understand if we have in mind left-wing utopias, especially utopias which are about the ideal city as a haven for the working class and the site of new collective life. But what do we make of a utopia which promotes individualism rather than collective life? In the same case, this seems to be different. Utopian life in Broadacre is not the new life of the collective, the working masses. It is the life of what Wright calls conveniently spaced individuals. Wright explicitly denies that his modernist values are ideologically neutral. Necessarily, he writes, this has nothing to do with capitalism, or communism, or socialism. The ism, in any form, does not have any individuality. Wright's utopia, for him, had nothing to do with any kind of politics. Rand also places blame for urban demise directly on socialist politics. The preacher of socialist politics in her novel Fountainhead is a certain character called Ellsworth Toohey, the art critic and socialist leader who has as his mission to destroy Rourke or Wright as a nonconformist individual. She has, Rand, Ellsworth Toohey say, quote, everything is contained in a single word, collectivism. And isn't this the God of our century? To act together, to think together, to unite, to agree, to obey, to serve, to sacrifice. But she considers this cynical. Toohey is the prototype of an ideologue, driven by the will to power rather than an altruistic impulse. Quote, divide and conquer first, he says after a collectivist rant, then unite and rule. Remember that the Roman emperor who said that he wished humanity so that it had a single neck that he could cut. What's interesting about this anti-socialist idea is that it is intimately tied to the visceral fear of the urban masses. In War Space, Anthony Bidler points out how the philosophy of Ayn Rand betrays a feeling of claustrophobia, the feeling of the fear of the crowd, and even the fear of touch, which her characters entirely avoiding physical contact, except when falling into sexual frenzy. Wright's fear of the mass, of the crowd, is no less prominent. The Disappearing City begins with the depictions of urban anxiety, which is the anxiety of mass existence. The citizen feels the horrifying warmth and pressure of the crowd. Surrenders to herd instinct. He shares instincts of the amorphous human herd, which, quote, swarms the erstwhile village streets. His nostalgia is nostalgia for a life in which people were conveniently enough spaced. This drive towards symbolic but also physical separation is the basis of defining the social unit as the man isolated in his automobile and separated from others in the peace of the 1 acre property. Ideology is the ideology of the other. Socialists, capitalists, communists. Wright and Rand have nothing to do with ideology. But if we accept Jameson's assertion, utopia has to have something to do with class. What kind of class consciousness can we detect in Wright's philosophy of individuality, of common individualship? Or what is class consciousness without the idea of a class? How is it articulated? I will start to unpack this by looking into what is the main allure, the main source of identification in Wright's and Rand's narratives. It is the phantasmagoria of the heroic individual, of which the architect is the embodiment. He solves all society's problems as the ultimate impersonation of creative powers that are to liberate humanity from the captivity of the city and herd-like existence. He is the demiurge of utopia, whose advent is no longer a matter of social structure, but more a matter of what is called architecture. Rand's Frank Lloyd Wright, alias Howard Roark, is the supernatural, misunderstood genius who finally triumphs over the ignorant and corrupt urban crowd, stoically confronting all obstacles on his path. In Wright, the heroic individual is also the American pioneer who conquered the West as bravely as broadacre dwellers will conquer suburbia. In Wright, the freedom of the suburban pioneer is in him being a mini architect, designing and building his suburban abode out of prefabricated elements and claiming, as an amateur designer builder, the natural right to individuality. Wright's point of identification is the brave pioneer. In Rand, it's the misunderstood genius who triumphs in his battle for recognition. What appeals to the reader in The Fountainhead, Ayn Rand's horrid prose, is that the figure of Roark, the misunderstood genius, indulges the reader's frustration with the exigencies of social life. Like Roark, the reader is faced in his dreary and difficult everyday life with misunderstanding, conflicts, unrealized ambition. When one reads Fountainhead and identifies with Roark, one can console oneself that all life difficulties are the result of him being a genius, being special, being too good for the world around him. And that he will finally triumph. I have to admit I was guilty of this. It was horrible. It was a torture to read Fountainhead, but I found myself fantasizing about how I'll be with Howard Roark. The world of architects, pioneers, suburban warriors is hyper-masculine. For Wright, the citizen of Broadacre is a manly man. Culture, according to him, should be the impregnator of new life. Machine power emasculates the man. The citizen can find no physical release. Creativity is reduced to a state of impotence. Life is reduced to impotence. Creativity is reduced to impotence. But in Broadacre, man will be impotent no more. He will finally begin to live in a man-like freedom. In Wright, the choice of wording expresses the virility of the citizen. In Ayn Rand, this entire theme is thoroughly sexualized. The Fountainhead contains the highly controversial scene where Roark makes a woman fall in love with him by raping her. In it, we can find the architect masturbating with his pen as a phallic object in scenes such as this one. Roark looked at the clean white sheet before him. His fist closed tightly about the thin stem of a pencil. He put the pencil down and picked it up again, his thumb running softly up and down the smooth shaft. He saw that the pencil was trembling. Howard Roark's physical work, represented here, is akin to the penetration of a woman. When Roark temporarily works on the construction site, he holds his fists tight around the drill, keeps his feet steady, pressed down hard, the flat rock an upward thrust against his. He feels the existence of his body, but only a few clots of tension. His knees, his wrists, his shoulder, and the drill he holds. To feel the drill trembling in a long convulsive shudder. To feel his stomach trembling, his lungs trembling. To feel the drill and his body. Wright's narrative is not unlike the verse of Rambo Amadeus. Neću da budem intelektualac, ne želimo kukurca lanac. I don't want to be an intellectual, I don't want to chain around my cock. The architect Broadacre suburban warrior is the virile, potent hero. His anti-hero is the intellectual. He's physically repulsive. In Rand, Rourke's nemesis, art critic and journalist Ellsworth Toohey, has a body, quote, like that of a chicken emerging from an egg, with all the sorry fragility of unhardened bones. He was declared on birth unfit to survive, was always sickly as a child, which is why he became interested in books instead of sports. He was not even manly enough to be good in mathematics. Instead, he learned history, English, civics, penmanship, psychology, and sociology, the suspicious humanities which build a feeble character. He went to Harvard, and of course, he wasn't even ever interested in sex, unlike the potent and virile Rourke. Formal education is the vehicle for executing power. Frank Lloyd Wright famously did not finish the university, and for him education is the main source of impotence. All culture came to be selected, he writes, came to be artificially adapted, and soon was, by way of education, arbitrarily applied by academic advice to growing power and to developing resources. But it failed, according to Wright, to qualify as an impregnator of new life and as an adequate interpreter of the new ideal on which the life of the country was initially founded. His repulsion for what he calls bookish learning in Broadacre, Wright intends to make schools small and, quote, smaller so far as possible, and instead of history, literature, rhetoric, bookish knowledge, he's going to teach drama. The conflict between the suburban and the urban is that between the self-made man coming from the margins of society and the urban elite. In The Disappearing City, the intelligentsia is described as what Althusser would call the ideological state apparatus. Its members are white-collarites and armies to add to other armies, petty officials whose, quote, complex rulings become the official proclamations of an urban army. An army which supports the rule of what Wright calls machine lords and money lords. The city is not unlike a military fortress, and its role is to safeguard the money lords and their army of intellectuals. In Rand, the anti-heroes whom Rourke has to confront are members of professional guilds who organize to defend their power and dominance, power acquired through inheritance, family connections, and the like. In contrast, her heroes start as pushcart peddlers, coal miners, and Rourke himself does not belong to the intellectual establishment, initially being, she says, a plumber, electrician, river catcher, and many other things. Here, we can finally come to understand what kind of class conflict is going on here, and which class identity Wright's Utopia formalizes. Education, the status of the intellectual, is also a mark of power, power against which Wright and Rand rebel in their own right-wing way. The canonic articulation of this problem is Angel Rama's book, The Lettered City, in which Rama writes about the class of letrados in Latin American history, the caste of the literate, who were not only the creators of literature, poetry, and art, but also the executors of colonial rule, which was based based on privileged access to letters. This story is kind of a classical story about the power of the intelligentsia based on this privileged access to literate culture. Wright's recourse to Victor Hugo's Cathedral of Notre Dame, in which Hugo famously stated, "This will kill that," referring to the destruction of architecture's social role by the printed book since the Renaissance, has to be seen in this light, actually. When he writes about the art and craft of the machine, about his fascination with ego, Wright refers to this problem. This is not only an aesthetic issue or an issue which concerns only architecture, but also articulates the desires of those on the margins of power and official literate culture. The self-made men inhabiting the suburban landscape are those who are situated on the margins of the city, not only in physical terms, but also in terms of access to culture and therefore power. Okay, all this would be very simple and a very linear narrative if Wright and Rand only condemned the city and strived to destroy it. But what is interesting is that their narratives betray a certain ambivalence toward the city and its power, a simultaneous attraction and repulsion. The city is not only the vortex of demoniac forces, it also figures as the materialization of the sublime. It is horrifying, but at the same time uncannily attractive. There is hatred for power embodied in and symbolized by the city. For Rand, it is the power of institutions, patrons, architects who rule the city yet cannot understand creative genius. For Wright, it is the horrifying presence of what he calls super millions and superfluous millions, adventitious fortune, landlords, money lords, who rob the American citizen of his birthright, the birthright of being a property owner. The frustrating presence of powers which, like in Rand, thwart the free creation of the architect, the freedom of the individual, and make utopia impossible, but in a new place outside city boundaries. But this is not all. For Rand, the city in the inside is a snake ruled by mediocrity and built by mediocrity. At the same time, one of her characters, Rourke's client Gail Wynan, claims that he would give the greatest sunset in the world for a view of New York's skyline, particularly when one can't see the details, just shapes. He claims that this vision is more powerful than religion, and that pilgrims of modernity should, quote, stand on the shore of Hudson, look and kneel. Despite his not-so-suppressed desire to blow up the city and dubbing it an exaggerating concentration of exaggerating buildings and exaggerating enterprises in the disappearing city, Wright also articulates in his work the pull the city has on the observer from the outside, not unlike the one that it has on Gail Wynan. As we can recollect, his famous paper, The Art and Craft of the Machine, ends with a long paean to the sounds, visions, movement of the city. It is this total rapture with, quote, the voice of this monstrous thing, this greatest of machines, the great city, which rises to proclaim the marvel of the units of its structure, the ghastly warning boom from the deep throats of vessels heavily seeking inlet into the waterway below, answered by the echoing clangor of the bridge bells growing nearer and more ominous as the vessel cuts momentarily the flow of the nearer artery, warning the current from the swinging bridge, now closing on its stately passage, just in time to receive in a rush of steam as a streak of light the avalanche of blood and metal hurled across it and gone roaring into the night on its glittering band of steel, ever faithfully encircled with the slender magic lines tip-tapping in its invisible protection. There is no way to do away with the city, even when one condemns it. What testifies to this is the main paradox of Wright's and Rand's enterprises. They condemn urban literate culture, the bookish culture, intellectualism, but they're intellectuals themselves. The disappearing city and the Fountainhead are pieces of writing, pieces of literary fiction executed in the medium of urban bookish culture. It is a question whether it can be otherwise. There is ultimately no utopia without ideology, and also no politics without the polis.